Okay, so in this video I'm going to demonstrate how H&P samples a soil vapor probe using helium gas as a leak tracer for leak detection. We're going to place a shroud, helium shroud over the soil vapor probe, fill it with helium, and check for leaks in our system. For the shroud for the leak check sampling, it can be any Tupperware or plastic tub. It just should be in correlation to the size of your probe. If you have some kind of well box, a 5-inch well box or a 12-inch well box, you'll need to make sure your shroud is the size to completely cover the entire well box. And the shroud should have 3 ports on it. One should just be a hole that your tubing is going to pass through and out of. One port is just some kind of fitting to connect your helium gas to inject into the shroud. And a third port should just have a valve that you can connect your helium detector meter so you can read the concentrations inside the shroud. Okay, the first step in placing our shroud is we want to run our soil vapor tubing off our probe in and out through the shroud through the small hole that's cut in the side. So I'm going to take the tubing, I'm removing the valve that's currently on there, and I'm going to run it inside and out through the shroud, placing the shroud down around the probe. I'm going to reconnect the valve that was currently on there, making sure it's airtight. If your soil vapor probe is inside a well, it has the probe only comes up, it can't run outside the shroud. You'll need to make some kind of connection with tubing so that you can run the tubing outside the shroud. And we have a small hole where our tubing's coming out, and I'm just going to plug that up a little bit with some plumber's putty that I have, just to keep, once we inject the helium, keep the helium in so it's not leaking out outside the shroud. It's a good idea to put some kind of weight down on the shroud to keep any helium from leaking out of the bottom as much as you can keep from leaking out of the bottom. I'm just going to place a small bucket on top of mine to help hold the shroud down. After you've run your probe out through the shroud, you've reattached the valve. At this point, you'll either want to install a 3-way valve or a T connection here that will branch off into your sampling device, your Suma canister or your syringe sample. I've got a 3-way valve here. I'm going to connect my probe into the 3-way valve and making sure the 3-way valve is open towards the sample pump right now. And the next step we're going to do before we do anything else is we're going to perform what's called a shut-in test. What a shut-in test does is it tests the integrity of all your fittings outside of the probe. So our helium is going to test that our probe doesn't have any leaks. Performing a shut-in test is going to make sure that there are no leaks in any of our fittings above ground throughout any of our system. Okay, so once I've connected our probe box to the soil vapor probe, the tubing leads up through our box here. We've got a magnet helic gauge that's going to read our probe vacuum. It runs through a flow meter that allows us to adjust the flow of the probe and ends up back to our pump. And the first step you want to do is conduct the shut-in test. So I'm going to turn the pump on and making sure that the valve on the soil vapor probe is in the off position. This is going to create a vacuum through our box and all our fittings, putting them under a vacuum so we can test if there's any leaks. So I'm going to watch the magnet helic gauge as I turn the pump on. I want to try and get it to right about 100 inches of water and make it hold there. So I'll turn the pump on. And I'm right about 100 inches of water. Now you want to watch that needle for about a minute and make sure there's no loss in vacuum. If the needle slowly drops, that means you've got a small leak somewhere in your fittings from this valve up to the edge of your pump. So if you notice any loss in that 1 minute, you'll want to adjust all your fittings, tighten them all up, and conduct the shut-in test again. Okay, so we've performed our shut-in test. We know everything is airtight above. Now we're ready to inject the helium into our shroud. We've got a tank of high purity grade helium. You want to make sure you use a high grade helium because if you have any small leaks in your system, the sample still may be valid, but if you have foreign contaminants in your helium, they could show up in your sample. So it's important to have a good high-grade helium. I'm just going to take my hose running from my tank, and I'm going to connect to the small fitting I have on the back of my shroud with a third sample port. So once we have our helium tank connected to our shroud, we're going to take, we've got a helium detector here. This is a helium multi-gas detector. Reads in ppm as well as percentage of helium. So with the detector running, I'm going to connect it to the shroud, opening my valve. So now the meter is drawn in from the shroud, and I'm going to slowly inject helium into the shroud, watching the meter, and I want to fill the shroud with approximately 50% helium. You want to keep your shroud above 50% helium throughout the whole sampling process. Once the shroud concentration is up over 50%, you can turn the helium tank off. Let the meter get the final percent concentration inside the shroud, and you want to disconnect your meter, and you're ready to begin purging and sampling. So after you filled the helium shroud with over 50% helium concentration, you're ready to start purging and sampling the well. Again, for lower purge volumes, smaller purge volumes, you can just use a syringe to purge and collect the sample. For larger purge volumes, you can use a pump setup like I have here. You'll need to, of course, calculate your purge volumes and figure out how long you need to run your pump for based on your flow rates. So you want to open the valve on your probe, and I can start purging the well set the proper flow rate, and timing the pump run time to get the proper purge volume amount taken out. You want to keep an eye on your magnehelic gauge to make sure that the vapor probe doesn't build up any vacuum. If you have tight formation or low flow permeability in your soil, anything over 100 inches of water, you may not be able to collect a sample out of. So after we've taken out our purge volume for the soil vapor well, now we're ready to collect a Tedlar bag to screen, to check for our helium leaks, see if there's any leaks in the system. We're going to fill a Tedlar bag with approximately 200 milliliters of sample, which we'll screen to see if there's any leaks in the probe. So connect my Tedlar bag, connect my pump to the lung box, and connect the end of the probe is now connected straight in line to the bag inside the box. And now I can start my pump and fill the Tedlar bag inside the lung box. There's many different kinds of lung boxes to fill a Tedlar bag. Based on whichever one you have, all the procedures are all the same. So I'll turn on my pump and fill the bag inside the box. Okay, we've filled the Tedlar bag in the lung box with approximately 200 milliliters of our soil vapor sample. We can now screen the sample with our meter. Just take the meter and connect to the bag. Open it up, and we read any concentrations the meter picks up with the bag. Once you've connected the meter to the bag and the meter's run, record any concentrations picked up helium on the helium meter from the bag. If you have under 10% of your shroud concentration in the bag, you can continue sampling. If you have over 10% concentration of helium in your bag, then you will want to reseal your probe or install a new probe altogether and resample. An example, if you have over 50% helium concentration in your shroud, a 10% leak in the bag would be 5% concentration picked up by the meter in your sample. One quick note about the shroud concentration: you want to maintain above 50% the helium concentration in the shroud. So periodically you may have to inject some more helium into the shroud and then you just simply hook onto your port, and you can test and make sure you're maintaining that 50% throughout the entire purging and sampling process. Okay, so once we've tested, we know the probe, there's no leaks in the probe. We've done our helium check. We can now sample the soil vapor probe, and at this point we're going to connect to our three-way valve that we installed just before the valve on the probe, just after the valve on the probe. And you just hook whatever sampling device you're using. If you're using a syringe, you can connect directly to it. If you're collecting a Suma canister, you can connect your Suma canister onto the valve. And making sure to pay special attention to the valve to shut the valve off towards the pump, so it's shut off, and now we're collecting from the probe into the Suma canister. We can open our can and collect our sample.